My stepson did this to me when my hand got stuck in the couch. It started as an ordinary afternoon, one of those lazy days when everything feels routine. I was tidying up the living room, casually rearranging the cushions on our old couch, when my hand slipped into the narrow gap between the cushions and got stuck. At first, it seemed laughable, just one of those clumsy moments you chuckle about later. But as I tried to pull my hand out, it became clear that it wasn't going to be so simple. The angle was awkward, and the more I struggled, the tighter it seemed to get. I could feel my frustration growing, and in the back of my mind I thought, why is this happening now? That's when my stepson walked into the room. He was always a quiet, observant boy, someone who kept his emotions carefully hidden. Over the past year, our relationship had been complicated. I had done my best to connect with him, but there was always a wall between us. As he noticed my predicament, I could see a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it concern? Amusement? I couldn't tell. He approached slowly, his expression unreadable, and for a moment I felt a sense of relief. Surely he would help me out of this ridiculous situation. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of offering assistance, he stood there, watching me struggle. His silence was unnerving, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. My heart began to race as I tried to read his intentions. Why wasn't he helping me? What was going through his mind? The tension grew thicker with every second, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was about to reveal something far deeper than just a stuck hand. And then he spoke, and his words changed everything. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as he said, "You always get yourself into these situations, don't you?" There was a strange tone to his words, one that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't teasing, but it wasn't warm either. My heart sank a little as I realized that this might be about more than just my hand stuck in the couch. For months, there had been a quiet tension between us. Becoming a stepmother was not something I had planned for, and stepping into his life after his mother's passing had been a delicate balancing act. He was polite, never outright rude, but his distance spoke volumes. There were moments when I thought we were making progress, like the time he joined me in the kitchen to bake cookies, or when he shared a rare smile after a joke I told. But those moments were fleeting, and most days he kept to himself, locked in his room or absorbed in his headphones. As he stood there now, his gaze sharp and unreadable, I couldn't help but wonder what I had done to push him further away. I tried to stay calm, laughing nervously as I tugged at my hand again. "Well, are you going to help me or just stand there?" I asked, keeping my tone light, though my chest felt heavy with unease. He tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Why should I?" he said quietly, and the words stung more than I expected. It was such a simple question, but it carried a weight that pressed against my chest. "Why wouldn't you?" I replied, trying to hide the hurt in my voice. His silence was louder than any argument we could have had. For the first time, I felt like I was seeing a side of him he had kept hidden, a side filled with resentment and pain. It wasn't just about me being his stepmother, it was about the unspoken grief, the changes, and the unhealed wounds we had both tiptoed around for months. As the room grew quieter, the weight of our fractured bond became impossible to ignore. He finally crouched down, his face close to mine, and whispered something I'll never forget. It wasn't a solution, but it was a glimpse into everything he had been holding back. His words echoed in my ears, leaving me frozen in place. "You wouldn't understand," he had whispered, his voice tinged with bitterness. My heart sank, not just because of the tension between us, but because of the layers of pain I could feel behind his statement. This wasn't just about me. It wasn't about my hand being stuck in the couch. It was about years of unresolved hurt that I had inadvertently walked into when I married his father. I looked up at him, trying to read his expression, but he had already pulled back, retreating to the safety of his usual stoic mask. "Try me," I said softly, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there, hands shoved into his pockets, his eyes darting to the window as if he was looking for an escape. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. I thought about all the times I had tried to connect with him, to bridge the gap that seemed to widen with every passing day. There was the time I bought tickets to his favourite band's concert, only for him to decline, saying he had already made plans. Or the time I tried to cook his mother's signature dish, hoping it would bring him some comfort, only for him to take one bite and excuse himself from the table. Every effort seemed to backfire, leaving me questioning if I was doing more harm than good. "I miss her," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. My chest tightened. He didn't need to say who he was talking about. The weight of his grief was palpable. "And then you came along, pretending to fix everything like it was that easy." His words stung, but I knew they weren't meant to hurt me. They were the raw, unfiltered truth of a teenager grappling with loss. "I'm not trying to replace her," I said carefully, afraid of saying the wrong thing. "I just want to be here for you, in whatever way you'll let me." He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "It's not that simple. Nothing about this is simple." For a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by the familiar walls he had built around himself. The air between us felt heavier than ever, and I realized that breaking through to him wasn't just about time or effort. It was about finding a way to show him that he wasn't alone in his pain, even if he didn't want to admit it yet. The room felt like it had shrunk, the silence thick and suffocating as his words lingered in the air. I wanted to reach out, to break through the layers of pain he had wrapped himself in, but every attempt seemed futile. My hand was still awkwardly wedged in the couch, a strange reminder of how stuck I felt in this situation too, trapped between wanting to help and not knowing how. "I never asked for this," he finally said, his voice trembling with restrained emotion. "I never asked for a new family or someone pretending to care." His words were like knives, cutting deeper with each syllable, but I knew I couldn't let his anger push me away. This wasn't about me. It was about him, about the scars he carried and the wounds that time had yet to heal. "I know you didn't," I replied gently, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "And I don't expect you to accept me overnight, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." He turned to me, his eyes flashing with something between defiance and desperation. "Why do you even care? You don't know what it's like to lose someone like that, to wake up every day and realize they're not coming back." The weight of his grief hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "You're right," I admitted, my voice soft but firm. "I can't pretend to know what you've been through, but I do know what it's like to feel alone, to think no one understands, and I don't want you to feel that way, not if I can help it." For a moment, he looked as though he might say something, but instead he turned away, his shoulders hunched in defeat. "It doesn't matter," he muttered. "Nothing's going to change." The tension in the room was unbearable, the unspoken words hanging between us like a fragile thread ready to snap. I could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that something was about to break. Whether it was his walls or my resolve, I couldn't yet tell. But one thing was certain, we were standing at the edge of something, and neither of us could turn back now. As the tension thickened, I stayed seated, my hand still awkwardly stuck, yet it seemed irrelevant now. His pain, his words, consumed the air between us. Just as I was about to respond, a loud knock at the front door shattered the silence. His head snapped toward the sound, and a flicker of something, fear, recognition, flashed across his face. He muttered, "Stay here," and rushed toward the door, his movements sharp and urgent. I strained to hear the muffled voices on the other side of the door. The tone was tense, and his voice grew increasingly agitated. "What are you doing here? I told you never to come back," he hissed, his words barely audible but heavy with intensity. Whoever was on the other side responded in low tones, their words unclear. but there was an edge to their voice that sent chills down my spine. Curiosity got the better of me. I wiggled my hand free from the couch and cautiously made my way toward the hallway. Peeking around the corner, I caught a glimpse of a man, mid-40s, with a rugged appearance and an air of menace. He had a strange familiarity about him, though I couldn't place it. My stepson stood rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his body language screaming confrontation. "You've done enough damage," my stepson spat. "We don't need you here." The man chuckled, a low, mocking sound that made my skin crawl. "Damage? You're still playing the victim, aren't you? You think shutting me out erases what happened? What was happening? Who was this man, and why did he seem to hold so much power over my stepson?" Before I could retreat unnoticed, the man's eyes darted toward me. "Well, well," he said with a smirk. "And who's this?" My stepson's body shifted slightly, blocking me from the man's view. "Leave her out of this," he growled, his voice protective and fierce. It was a tone I had never heard from him before, and it only deepened the mystery. The man ignored him, his eyes boring into me as though he could see straight through to my soul. "She doesn't know, does she? About what you did?" My heart thudded painfully in my chest. What was he talking about? My stepson's face paled, and for the first time, he looked truly terrified. "Get out!" he yelled, his voice cracking under the strain. The man stepped back but left a parting shot. "Secrets don't stay buried forever, kid. You should have learned that by now." He walked away, his laughter echoing down the hallway. My stepson slammed the door shut, leaning against it as if to keep the weight of the world at bay. "What did he mean?" I asked softly, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, his gaze locked on the floor. The room seemed to grow colder as I realized that whatever this was, it was far bigger and darker than I could have imagined. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. My stepson stood with his back against the door, his chest rising and falling as if he had just run a marathon. He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and fear. "I didn't want you to find out like this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I walked closer, my heart still racing from the confrontation. "Find out what? Who was that man? What's going on?" The questions spilled out of me, but he just shook his head, struggling to find the right words. "He's my father," he admitted after a long pause. The weight of his confession hung heavy in the room. "He left when I was a kid, left my mum to pick up the pieces. He only shows up when he wants something. Money, favors, anything he can take." The anger in his voice was palpable, but there was also pain, a deep wound that had never fully healed. "I've tried so hard to keep him out of my life," he continued, "but he keeps coming back, stirring up trouble. I didn't want you to get dragged into it." I sat down, trying to process everything. "Why didn't you tell me before? I could have helped." He looked at me, his expression softening. "Because I didn't want you to see me as damaged. You've been the only person who's believed in me, and I was scared that if you knew everything, you'd look at me differently." I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to carry this alone. Families are messy, but we're in this together. We'll figure it out." For the first time that evening, he smiled. A small tentative smile, but one that spoke volumes. It wasn't a perfect resolution. His father's shadow would likely linger, but we had taken the first step toward healing. Together we would face whatever came next, one day at a time. As we sat in the quiet living room, the tension began to lift. Sometimes the hardest stories to confront are the ones we carry within ourselves. But in sharing them, we find strength, understanding, and a way forward.